Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is John Osana, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today's webinar is titled Aquatic Ecosystem Vulnerability to Fire and Climate Change in Alaskan Boreal Forests. And we're excited to have Stephen Gray and Jeff Falke from the U.S. Geological Survey with us today. To introduce our speakers, we have Emily Fort, who is currently serving as the acting USGS Director of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Emily?
Great, thanks, John, and hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm happy to introduce our speakers. We have Jeff Falke. He's a research fisheries biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and the acting unit leader of the Alaska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Jeff holds faculty appointments as assistant professor in the Department of Fisheries, Institute of Arctic Biology, and the Department of Fisheries, all at UAF. He's worked on issues surrounding the interaction between fire and climate change in aquatic ecosystems since 2010. And then Steve Gray is the USGS Director for the Department of the Interior's Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, and he has a great deal of experience in this arena as well. So thanks, Steve and Jeff, for your presentation.
Thank you, Emily. And Stephen, you now have the floor to give your presentation.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, John and Emily. Let me know if you see my screen coming up, and we'll go from there.
You're all good.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. And thanks also to Scott Rupp, who could not be here today, our university director from University of Alaska Fairbanks. Got called away at the last minute to D.C. to attend to some business there. So I'm really just stepping in for him. What I wanted to do first is take a few minutes to kind of set the stage and explain how this work that you're going to be hearing about today fits into the larger Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center portfolio. So Jeff's work is not a CASC-funded project, but rather it leverages past and ongoing work at the CASC. In collaboration with our university leadership, we're looking more and more to this model where the CASC provides basic building blocks of a project that then brings in significant support from other sources. We're already seeing this happen in some projects that are funded by NASA, a couple of large NSF EPSCoR efforts, and more and more work with DoD, Department of Defense. It's a win for everyone because the initial CASC investment attracts new funding for the university and our USGS partners, and we all get the additional benefit of the capacity it gives us for addressing key natural resource management issues. So again, just wanted to set the stage there. One of the first efforts that you'll see leveraged in here is the CSC work, ongoing work related to climate projection downscaling. We've been at this for over 7 years, and unlike many similar efforts in other regions, we're not primarily focused on just increasing the spatial resolution of climate projections, but rather we're focused instead on providing management relevant climate information, and that often means filling in gaps in the existing monitoring network or the historical climate record that we have. A lot of that has to do, or much of that work relates to creating data sets related to snowfall, because that's so important to the work that's done here and also plays into some of the fire work that's been done. But also, we're really doing this in a way where we're bringing information or input from the user community to guide this effort. So don't worry about the exact contents here, but you have a list of target variables that have been developed in collaboration or cooperation between the climate modelers, the ecosystem modelers, and the resource managers. These are basically climate variables that they need to understand the systems that they're working on, and that's what's guiding this effort. Second part of previous work that plays a big role in what Jeff will be presenting today is the work of our ecosystem or integrated ecosystem modeling effort. This is work that brings together three existing models that describe portions or processes of these boreal and far northern ecosystems in a way that each bit or component of the model can talk to the other. So it makes sense. It's a real world depiction of the way that these systems operate. And a lot of what you're going to be hearing about today builds on or relates to output from that model that speaks specifically to characteristics of burns or fires in these northern ecosystems. But more than that, this is just an overall piece of the vision of how this program and the operation of the CASC more broadly fits together. I already told you about how we're developing these climate products that are serving as inputs to the modeling effort. And then what Jeff is going to be talking about today is this key component of taking those model outputs and data sets and treating that in a way that helps us gain value in terms of applying it to management decisions. So I think I'll leave it right there and just pass it over to Jeff. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks, Steve, for that introduction. That was great. So to start out today, I'd like to thank my co-investigators on this project, so Scott Rupp, Peter Benyek, and Helene Genet, and also the project personnel that are working with me on this project, postdoc Stephen Klobuchar, project biologist Deanna Klobuchar, and a PhD student, Elizabeth Hinkle. So this work wouldn't have been possible without funding and a network of collaborators that we've put together as part of this project. The project is primarily funded by the Department of Defense and their Strategic Environmental Research and Development Programs, specifically their Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area. We've also built a network of collaborators to work with on this project, including USGS and UAF, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and then the Alaska Fire Science Consortium and the Northwest Boreal LCC. So some background on the project. So we know by now that across the western U.S. that wildfires are increasing in frequency and magnitude. This is also linked to climate. So we know that in large fire years, they're also wet and dry, or warm and dry. So there's a direct link to climate there. Also, large fire years typically occur in years that have an earlier snowmelt. And then in combination with these shorter winters, the fire season has increased dramatically over the past several decades. So what about the future? Well, from a global perspective, fire dynamics are expected to continue to change over both the near term and the long term. We expect changes in the increases in the likelihood of fire into the future, ramping up with changes in climate. And if you look, might be a little bit difficult to see here, but across the northern latitudes, there's strong agreement in the direction of this change based on a suite of climate models. Now, fire is widespread across interior Alaska. And so here the red polygons are the perimeters of fires that have occurred in interior Alaska since the 1940s. And this basically matches up with the distribution of the boreal ecosystem in interior Alaska. And this is because fire is really the primary disturbance agent in this ecosystem. And so similar to the western U.S., fire dynamics are also changing in Alaska. Here's a graph of the total area burned across the state from 1950 to present. And what we see here is that fires that have been classified, or fire years that have been classified as much above normal or above normal, have been increasing both in magnitude and frequency since about the 1980s. And some of this is likely due to the changing environment that's occurring in Alaska. Here's some data from the recently published National Climate Assessment. And basically, Alaska is warming at about twice the rate of the lower 48 and the rest of the U.S. And then looking out into the future, we expect a warmer environment in Alaska, regardless of the emissions scenario that you look at. Predictions range of increases in mean annual temperatures anywhere from 8 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 16 degrees Fahrenheit, especially pronounced in the Arctic and the subarctic regions of Alaska. So what does this mean for ecosystems? Well, climate change is predicted to have major effects on terrestrial ecosystems, mainly through vegetation change. So for example, here on the left is a graph showing the predicted distribution of spruce and deciduous forests in Alaska under two different climate change scenarios. So we see spruce forests decreasing and deciduous forests increasing over time. And then also the other major player here, of course, is permafrost. And so here's a map of the current distribution of permafrost. The blue areas are places where permafrost is present and black is absent. And then once we get out to about 2100, the predictions are showing that permafrost will be largely absent from interior Alaska. And of course, fire can exacerbate vegetation change and permafrost thaw, and then vice versa. So there's feedbacks between these processes. All right, so this project that I'm going to tell you about today, we're just getting started on, and it deals with aquatic ecosystems response to fire and climate change. So I thought I'd give a little review on the fire effects on aquatic species and habitats just to get started here. So the question I get asked a lot, is, are fires bad for fish? Well, according to Smokey the Bear, apparently so. There's an old poster, and I don't know if you can read this header on the poster, but it says, "Forest fires catch fish too." And that can be the case. High magnitude disturbances such as fire can have immediate impacts, including species extirpations, especially when they're exacerbated by other events such as debris flows and floods. But it's increasingly understood that for fish and aquatic ecosystems, that fires aren't necessarily a bad thing for aquatics. In fact, periodic fires can contribute to the long-term persistence of fish populations through these disturbance processes that create and maintain critical habitats. And this is particularly important in smaller streams because the in-stream processes are really closely linked to the surrounding landscape. So fire can affect various aspects of stream ecosystems differentially. I'm not going to go through each of these, but fire can affect channel stability, can increase discharge and flooding, increase the input of large wood into the streams, increase sediment and turbidity, and then of course increase solar radiation getting to the stream if the riparian area is burned. So the rate of ecosystem recovery from fire also depends on the metric that you're looking at. So here's an older figure from a paper by Bob Gresswell where we have a bunch of different stream ecosystem components and their response post-fire, in the year post-fire, and then off into the future. And so the main point here is that the rate of recovery of these processes varies immediately following the fire versus kind of further out into the future. We can see here, for example, that there's spikes in turbidity and nutrient following fire, which quickly tail off. And then that it's expected that the organisms, such as fishes, recover more slowly. But we've seen that in many cases that these highly mobile organisms like fishes are often the first species to recolonize into these burdened environments following a disturbance. So with respect to the biological effects, there's not a huge body of literature out there on the subject, but if we kind of look across all of it, the responses of fish and other aquatic taxa to fire seem to vary kind of by trophic level and as a function of the intensity of the fire and then how long it's been since the fire. Pulses of nutrients following a fire can increase primary production in streams, particularly if the riparian canopy is removed by fire, but this is mediated by increases in turbidity. And then the abundance and quality of fish and vertebrate prey can also be affected, especially when this riparian vegetation is removed and it's no longer a source of energy-rich terrestrial-derived prey items. Fish responses vary as well. We've seen increases and decreases in growth rates, likely as a result of elevated water temperatures. In cold limited systems, such as some of those that we have in interior Alaska, we might actually expect an increase in fish growth following a fire. And then a study in Idaho showed that trout in burned streams matured earlier and grew faster, which are characteristics of a colonizing life history or population. some interesting results there. So at the population level, climate and fire interactions can drive population vulnerability of sensitive species. Here are the results from some recent work that we did on bull trout in central Washington. So bull trout require really cold water, and we expect that the amount of available habitat, which is shown here on this graph, to shrink in the future relative to current conditions or the status quo, likely or regardless of the climate scenario. So the interaction here is that given the increases that we expect in the average fire size, it's likely that in the future, the average fire sizes will actually be larger than the patches of bull trout habitat, which means that if a fire happens within one of those habitat patches, it's likely to burn the entire patch. But these effects of fire on fish and population vulnerability can vary by life stage. So it's important to look across different life stages. Here's another recent study that we did, again, in central Washington, but now looking at Chinook salmon and breaking this out by eggs, juveniles, and adult life stages. And so what we found was that we predicted that the habitat quality, if you will, for eggs and fry in adults was lower post-fire, but juvenile habitat quality actually increased significantly. So here's just a graphical representation of that. So the colors on here correspond to the quality of juvenile habitat, with red colors being high quality. Here's the pre-fire on the left, post-fire in the middle, and then I'll draw your attention here to the right-hand side where is the change in habitat quality pre and post-fire. And we can see a lot of this orange on there, which is designating an increase in that habitat quality. And most of that is a result of the increase of large wood to the streams, which is a really critical habitat component for juvenile Chinook salmon. So hopefully I've shown you so far that fire effects on aquatic ecosystems are a complex web of interactions among fire and vegetation and geology and climate, etc. This is a well illustrated in a figure from a recent review by Bixby and others. So what we hope to do with this project in interior Alaska is to disentangle some of this complex web of responses of organisms to fire in interior Alaska. And so the project that we're just getting started on has three main components, and with the overall goal of assessing ecosystem vulnerability to fire and climate change in the boreal forest and identify factors that drive vulnerability to fire. And so for the first objective, we use a combination of fieldwork and modeling to quantify patterns of fire impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Then we'll conduct a vulnerability assessment based on an integration of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem models. And then finally, we'll use this information to work with managers to develop fire scenarios and decision support tools to assist with aquatic species conservation in this fire-prone boreal aquatic landscape in interior Alaska. So I'll go through and briefly describe our plans for each of these objectives. So here's just a flow chart of the project, and we'll start over here on the left-hand side at kind of the local scale. We'll focus on field work and some modeling that results from that. But first of all, I'll tell you about the study area. So the study area here is located in interior Alaska. We're focused on 4 river basins: the Chattanooga, Chena, Salcha, and Goodpaster. These are all tributaries to the Tanana River, which is then a tributary to the Yukon. Fairbanks, where I'm at, is located is the green star here on the map. So about 4,000 square kilometers have burned in this area since the early 1980s. Here the red is the distribution of fire perimeters, and then in yellow here is the distribution of Department of Defense lands. So this is a large area. It's about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. So these basins support important fisheries, especially the Chena and the Salcha river basins are the first and second largest producers of Chinook salmon in the entire Yukon River Basin. And then all four rivers are important Arctic grayling recreational fisheries. And so we're going to focus on these two species for this project. Here's just another map of fires. Now I've broken it down by the burn history. We can see that there's a mosaic of burn histories across the study area. And now we're going from 1950 to present. The older burns are here in green, and the recent burns are in orange and brown. You can see there's a lot more orange and brown on there than green. So for the field part of it, we're interested in contrasting sites that are located in recently burned areas versus historically burned areas versus controls or those that haven't had fire since the 1950s. There's no real controls in the boreal forest because all of these areas are in some state of post-fire succession. And we're going to use a spatially balanced sampling design to select sites that are similar with respect to stream size and elevation, et cetera. The field piece will be limited to wadable streams. This is for access reasons and logistics. Plus, we expect that the fire impacts are going to be easier to detect in these smaller streams. So the part of the field work at each one of our sites will install sensors that will continuously measure climate, stream flow, water temperature, and water chemistry, and we've already started some of this last summer. And then during the first summer of 2019, we'll take a shotgun approach and sample a large set of sites across the four basins to look at broad patterns in fish community composition relative to those fire history classes. And then we'll kind of dial in on and do some intensive sampling at a subset of sites within the treatment categories where we'll collect a suite of physical and biological data, which is some of it is listed here. So through this field sampling, we'll have collected data necessary to parameterize two predictive models. We're interested in looking at freshwater food webs through an aquatic trophic productivity model. And then also we'll use an individual-based model to look at fish biomass and population dynamics. We'll also investigate these changes based on a range of observed conditions by fire history, and then incorporate our predicted climate impacts as well, which will result from the second objective, which was to, again, to integrate a suite of climate, terrestrial, and aquatic ecosystem models, and then produce a vulnerability analysis based on those models. So our environmental and hydrologic models will be driven by this sophisticated climate model. Steve touched on this a little bit. We'll use output from the weather research and forecasting model, which will give us historic and future precipitation, air temperature, and other climate variables. And using recently developed techniques, we'll dynamically downscale these data from sort of the coarse GCM scale all the way to 20 or even 4 kilometer spatial resolution for the study area. And then, as Steve suggested earlier, we plan to model current and future fire and terrestrial vegetation and permafrost dynamics using 2 modeling frameworks which have been developed in Alaska. These are part of that integrated ecosystem model. And what we plan to do is to link the outputs from these models, the vegetation and fire and permafrost changes, to 3 aquatic ecosystem models, one of which covers watershed processes called NetMap, hydrology, the VIC model, and then stream temperature, which is called LST, and I'll talk a little bit about those right now. So we'll look at watershed processes using a program called NetMap. We're working with Lee Benda at TerrainWorks to derive digital stream networks for our 4 study basins based on a digital elevation model. This is really critical because interior Alaska currently lacks high-resolution digital representations of stream networks, so we're having to sort of build this from the bottom up. And so what the NetMap model does is it produces this stream networks, and then you're able to predict in-stream geomorphic attributes such as channel type here in panel A, but also conditions on hill slopes, such as soils and slope and aspect that control erosion and sediment delivery, which of course are directly related to some of these fire impacts that I talked about earlier. So we just received these data a couple of weeks ago, so they're sort of hot off the presses. Just show a kind of an example application here that we could do with this. We could, for example, identify reaches of stream that have high erosion potential. So it's maybe a little bit hard to see here, but we can see these red reaches of stream are close to this hill slope, and we expect the erosion to be higher in this area. We can overlay that predicted vegetation and permafrost, et cetera, and look at how that varies throughout the study area. So basically, we have spatially explicit and continuous predictions across the about 11,000 kilometers of streams that are located in our study area. So stream temperature is a critical control on fish growth and survival. And so we plan to use a model that we developed in Oregon and Washington to predict stream temperature across the study area every 1 kilometer at an 8-day time step. And so we'll model stream temperatures based on the relationship between remotely sensed land surface temperature, which is available from NASA's MODIS platform, and then relate that to measured stream temperatures from our field study, and then also previous data that we've collected over the past several years across these 4 basins. We'll be able to predict future land surface temperature or emissivity because it is one of the outputs of that WRF climate model. So we've already implemented this to some degree in the Chena River Basin, which is this figure down here below. This is a map of the growth potential for juvenile Chinook salmon. We've shown that this temperature model works well in interior Alaska. And this is just the results of this riverscape bioenergetics model that we've just wrapped up and is currently being considered for publication. And we plan on expanding this model or applying it across the other 3 basins as part of this study. So stream flow is also very important. It's considered a master variable in stream ecosystems. So we plan on modeling the spatial and temporal patterns of flow in the 4 basins using a hydrologic model, which will be driven by output from that WRF climate model, as well as vegetation conditions from that alfresco model and permafrost conditions as well from the DV-IBDOS-10, the integrated ecosystem model. And then this will all be routed through those stream networks that we've developed as part of that NetMap software. Each of our 4 basins has USGS flow gauges that we can use to calibrate these models. So the basic framework for this is already in place. We've already done some preliminary flow regime classification for the Chena River, shown here in this figure on the bottom. And we'll expand this to the other basins and then incorporate this information from these other models. We're also currently conducting a review of boreal stream flow regimes from which we can look at broad patterns of hydrologic variability and fire across the broader Arctic boreal ecosystem. So the second part of the second objective, will use output from these integrated models to assess the vulnerability of Chinook salmon in the 4 basins to current and future fire dynamics and climate change. And the plan right now is to use a Bayesian network approach to look at vulnerability. Now, we chose Chinook salmon because they're a species of concern. They're very important for both ecologically, commercially, and for subsistence use in Alaska. They also spawn and rear over a large area within these basins, so they likely integrate these stressors within their population dynamics. And then we'll produce some life stage specific estimates similar to what we did in the Central Washington study. So the Bayesian network approach is really appealing for a study like this because it allows us to track uncertainty throughout the models It allows us to incorporate both quantitative and qualitative information. It's easily updatable with new information. We can have spatially explicit predictions, and then we can incorporate multiple scenarios. So just as an example, here's some results from the study in Central Washington on bull trout. This is a similar approach here. So here's a map of bull trout vulnerability to fire, and this is the scale of these predictions is that of a 1 kilometer stream reach. So red here are places that are more vulnerable, and green are places that are less vulnerable. But again, one of the key outputs from the Bayesian approach here, that as far as I'm concerned, is that you can also track uncertainty. So here's a map of the uncertainty in those vulnerability predictions. So you can see some places that are predicted to have low vulnerability and low uncertainty in that classification, as well as some areas that are predicted to have low vulnerability but have a lot of uncertainty associated with those estimates. So those might be places that we want to update the model or look at individually a little closer. So the last part of this project is to use a structured decision-making process to elicit input from fire managers in order to evaluate scenarios of changing fire and climate dynamics on aquatic ecosystems. So fire management in Alaska differs a little bit from the lower 48. In Alaska, fire options are designated into 4 broad management options. So everything from critical protection or full protection here, which is essentially put fires out, suppress fires, all the way to limited protection, which is essentially maintain the natural fire regime and minimize suppression. And so the other key piece of information here is that these options are set by the particular land management entity. In other words, managers select these options for their lands to reflect their objectives and their agency mission. So here's a map of the current state of fire management options in Alaska. We can see here that about 65% of the state is in this limited protection and natural fire regimes. So we'll zoom in here to this area near Fairbanks and look a little bit closer. So previous work by Scott Rupp and his team looked at the implications of, or developed a framework to evaluate the effects of changing fire management options on terrestrial ecosystems. So for example, so Fairbanks is located right about here on kind of the upper left-hand part of these graphs. So the upper left blob here is the current management, and then the lower right blob is new management option. So what we could do here is look and see, so for example, for these large tracts of DoD land outlined in yellow, what would be the implications of changing from a limited protection option up here in the upper left to a full protection option here on the lower right? So what would that look like? This is an example simulation that results for 2 climate scenarios, one that is a moderately warm and wetter future, and the other that's a very warm and drier future. And so the solid lines are that current fire management option, and the dotted lines are the alternative fire management option. And so we can look at the predicted area burned under those 2 different options, or under the alternative options in these 2 different climate scenarios. And so the difference here between the solid and the dashed lines is the difference in area burned that would be predicted if you switched from, for example, a limited protection to a full protection across those 2 particular tracts, large tracts of lands. So we're going to utilize this the same utility for our new project to interface with Department of Defense, state and federal fire managers to explore fire management scenarios that may impact aquatic habitats. And we'll use a structured decision-making process shown here on the left to engage with and elicit input from managers with respect to scenario development. On the right are some examples of web-based tools that were produced for this previous study on terrestrial ecosystems. They allow the user to map and do some data exploration on fire and climate impacts. This particular example is on terrestrial ecosystems. Our work will focus on aquatic ecosystems, and the team that we've put together here has the capacity to build out these types of tools for managers and the public. So that was all I have for you. You know, it was a lot of information and sort of a lot of this is what we're going to do. I do appreciate the opportunity to share this project with you, and I'm very interested in any feedback that you could provide either right now or later, and my contact information is here.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jeff.